Okay, everybody, it is noon, and we're going to get started because we have a really great session for lunch. So my name is Kim Marasek. I'm the Director of Planning for the Center for Planning Excellence, and I want to first start by thanking our session sponsors, LIPSI, plus all the summit sponsors who are listed in the program and in the slideshow between sessions. The summit would not be possible without their support. And I'm just going to get straight into introductions because today at lunch we have a great treat, and we have a wonderful speaker who has been at the summit multiple times. I think we decided this is his fifth visit to the summit, so we're happy to have him back. So I want to go ahead and welcome Christopher Coes, who is the Assistant Secretary for Transportation, the Department of Transportation. We have spent the morning today talking in depth about opportunities for Louisiana's future, making robust investments in renewable energy, and ensuring that we are investing equitably in our capital region. And today, Chris is going to dive into future transportation opportunities for our communities and how to ensure that the investments we're making there are resilient and equitable, while also improving the livability of our neighborhoods and communities. So, like I mentioned, he currently serves under Pete Buttigieg as the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at USDOT, and previously he was the Vice President for Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. Through these roles and others, he has been instrumental in driving the conversation around cultivating better transportation options for American communities. And today, we're collectively going to pick his brain about how we can make progress in transportation policy here in Louisiana. So please join me in welcoming Christopher to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, come on, I grew up in Thomasville, Georgia, at a Baptist church. Good afternoon, everyone. Good. It's so good to be here. Hopefully this works. Uh-oh. There we go. Can you guys hear me? All right. You know, mics never behave. Let's do this. All right, let's just do that. First, I just want to say thank you to Kim to that great introduction. Also want to say my thanks to Camille, who's just been a great leader here at CPEX, and just really great to see so many of you after a couple of years in hiatus during the pandemic, just seeing you guys here in person and seeing that this summit continues. And also to a dear friend in the movement, Boo Thomas, for your wisdom and your legacy. Again, I just bring greetings from the Department of Transportation and Secretary Buttigieg. It's really a great pleasure. Oh, so there was a guy who's going to fix the mic. Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you. As you guys know, as community planners, community leaders, is this working? Okay, good. As community planners and leaders, we have fought for many years for investments that we now see in the bipartisan infrastructure law and in the Inflation Reduction Act. We have been looking, and now I think we can all say we're standing in what will be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to advance many of the principles that has been subscribed for the last 2 days at the summit, but really the idea that we can truly create transformative and thriving communities through good and thoughtful transportation projects that can really truly create a sense of place, advance equity, address climate change, and make our communities, our streets safer, regardless of the transportation mode or where you live. You know, I'm really here today to talk about the DOT's approach and our framework of how we are advancing smart growth, some of the key opportunities that we see, and how you, the advocates, the local government, our nonprofits, allies, as well as our state partners, how you can join into this journey to actually create more thriving communities. So I want to start off by first, before I start talking about money, and I know you all enjoyed Beth Osborne's presentation yesterday, but before we start talking about the money within the bipartisan infrastructure law, it is important for me to highlight the department's framework, how we actually think about our day-to-day and our strategic goals, and how it is actually being the baseline and the principles that we're embedding in every federal investment and policy initiative that we are pursuing. And one of the things you should see immediately as a Department of Transportation is that safety is our North Star. How does a project advance safety or move us closer to eliminating transportation-related serious crashes, injuries, as well as fatalities? Of course, it should be no surprise that economic competitiveness, economic strength, and global competitiveness is one of our major strategic goals, but it's also thinking about not only from a global standpoint, but how can we ensure transportation investments is actually improving not only the lives, the quality of life, but actually the physical health of our regions and our local government. For the first time in the Department of Transportation's history, we've made advancing equity a strategic priority over the next 5 years. And it really speaks to this idea of how do we take our policies, our data, as well as these new investments to eliminate disparities and pass a harmful environmental justice. Of course, climate sustainability is one of our major key strategic priorities, as well as transformation. But one of the things I like to do, for those who are not familiar with the Office of Policy within the Department of Transportation, our unique role is actually to develop our overall strategic framework, but also develop a transportation infrastructure package when it comes to reauthorization. But we have a shorthand with our office, is that our job, when we look back over the next 4 years, maybe 8 years, our job is, can we say we are achieving 0 deaths, 0 emissions, and 0 disparities in our work? And of course, as part of that, when it comes to 0 deaths, we have made a huge attempt for the first time ever establishing a national roadway strategy and an approach, recognizing, unfortunately, even during the pandemic, with fewer people on the roadways, we have seen an increased level of fatalities and roadway deaths. And I know it comes to no surprise to any of you that the fact that those deaths, those fatalities have happened in rural communities, but unfortunately and also disproportionately in Black and brown communities. Of course, when it comes to 0 emissions, we have a unique opportunity as not only as a country, but globally for the United States to be a leader in the fight of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But last but not least, for us recognizing that we have a unique moment for that transportation is no longer the metaphor, the analogy of saying I'm on the other side of the railroad tracks for our communities anymore. Sometimes when I hear from smart growth advocates when it comes to the bipartisan infrastructure law, I have to remind them that there are major smart growth principles and policies embedded in the bipartisan infrastructure law. For example, through the hard work of groups like CPEX and the National Complete Streets Coalition, for the first time within the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have a definition of complete streets. The idea that we want people to be able to walk, to be safely move throughout their built environment safely, regardless if you're in a car or not. But in addition to that definition, we also made a requirement for states and MPOs to use their resources, particularly to actually engage in working with local governments to do complete streets planning, but also be able to retrofit their communities where they're seeing highest level of fatality. Of course, you hear a lot about our safety work, which is right now the bipartisan infrastructure law gives the most significant level of resources, but also from a land use, transportation, housing connection, for the first time, we are now working with our Federal Highway Administration, our Federal Transit Administration, to update our transportation planning processes where we are now incorporating housing and land use as well as economic development as MPOs are developing their updated tips. Last but not least, right now, state DOTs are working on developing their own carbon reduction plan, which is the first ever in a bipartisan, in the history of a transportation authorization. In addition, many of the states, including the state of Louisiana, also identified how they're going to approach the $5 billion that we just released to them on building out the national EV charging infrastructure. This is just a snapshot of many of the smart growth principles that you've been talking about over the last day and a half that are now embedded into the bipartisan infrastructure law. I say that to say because it's an important framing for you when you're thinking about, wow, there's this new bill. What does it mean not only for the broader movement, but what does it mean from our community? It is important for you to understand how we see the world and how we are going to approach every dollar, every policy, every regulation moving forward, even before we talk about the big grants that we will discuss today. As noted, the bipartisan infrastructure law is a once-in-a-lifetime funding level for our communities. As noted many times, I'm sure in this conference and probably many of the webinars that you've heard, but for those who just woke up yesterday and heard that it was a massive infrastructure package, as you know, as part of this bipartisan infrastructure law, we have about 600 of what was $1.2 trillion, $660 billion of those resources come to the Department of Transportation over the next 5 years. And as you see here, those dollars are broken across our many modes. So for federal highway, about $365 billion. For Federal Transit Administration, have $107 billion. For the Federal Railroad Administration, about $102 billion, and so forth and so forth. But one of the things I highlight here, which is very important to understand, 69% of the $660 billion that is a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law flows through what we call formula. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you are aware of formula programs? What does that mean? I see a lot of hands down. So let me explain. So traditionally, there are two buckets of money: formula dollars, discretionary grant dollars. Formula dollars from the lens of the Department of Transportation is when we serve as a pass-through. We receive the money from the Treasury, and we give it directly to state DOTs, to MPOs, local governments, and transit agencies. We do not, as a federal government, have the ability to dictate which project those entities can fund. And so from this standpoint, 69% of those dollars from the $660 billion are going to state DOTs, to transit agencies, and to local government. Now, you may be saying, that seems like a lot of money. In previous authorizations, that number was closer to 80 to 90%. A significant share of the dollars in this round is actually moving to what we call discretionary grants as well. And those are dollars where you, a local government, an MPO, a nonprofit working with those entities, as well as state DOTs, can apply to the federal government to have direct access to those resources. And for the first time, I think one of the things for my office of Policy, we have about $45 billion that we have to manage in terms of discretionary grants. So I can tell you we are very busy at the Department of Transportation. Now, there are a number of new programs at the Department of Transportation that I would like to talk about really quickly. First and foremost, of that $45 billion, we have new programs that really address some of those critical policy priority areas that I talked about earlier. First being one that I know there's a lot of interest around, which is our Safe Streets and Roads for All program. This is by far the first competitive discretionary grant program dedicated to local governments who are trying to plan or execute capital projects to reduce roadway fatalities and injury on their roadways. In other words, if you have a Vision Zero plan that you now know these are the 5 intersections that have the majority of our deaths or roadway fatalities, you actually now have dollars to support either the capacity building or the execution of those plans. Or another way, if you really just want your community to be a safe place to walk, bike, and also drive, this is the program for you. In addition to that, we have a new bridge program, about $16 billion, dedicated to repairing the fact that in this country, we have a lot of bridges that are in a poor condition and at the end of their life cycle. One of the things I highlight here is that oftentimes you hear the bridge program, there's a formula part, but actually one of the key things here is there's also a discretionary grant program that allows local governments to apply for projects that are not necessarily owned by their state DOTs. In addition to that, we have what is called the Reconnecting Communities Pilot Program, which I heard in the previous panel, there was a lot of interest around, which our office managed, and we can talk about that. But a couple of things I'll also highlight, because I'm in Louisiana, as a fellow Southerner. Now, I come from Thomasville, Georgia, so I'm more of an ACC guy. I know this is big SEC territory, so there's no need for us to have any fights today. Although, go Dogs, no kidding. One of the issues that we know is that we want to ensure that particularly rural communities have access. And one of the things that we are excited about is there's a new $2 billion program dedicated for rural communities and their unique needs. This is just an example. Now, of course, I'm in Louisiana. Resilience is a major issue, and we have by far one of the largest infrastructure investments just in climate sustainability and resiliency of our infrastructure. Now, these are some of our newer programs, but many of you are very aware of some of our existing programs that were significantly increased as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you are aware of what is called the RAISE grant program? Okay, Rebuilding America's Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, formerly known as BUILD, formerly known as TIGER, used to be an annual appropriation program that roughly was between $500 to $900 million. Now, on an authorized basis, on an annual basis, will receive $1.5 billion to support that program. And here's the kicker. As part of FY22, in addition to the 1.5 guaranteed funding that the department received, Congress, hearing from you, gave the department an additional $700 million, bringing the grand total to $2.2 billion to support local projects across the country. And I can tell you in the FY22 round, we gave over 166 grants in every state, in every territory. And this is by far one of our most competitive, but our most flexible dollars that many of you smart growth advocates have been looking for. Of course, we have our multimodal freight program that saw significant increase in dollars. But one of the things I know that from Baton Rouge down to New Orleans and many parts of the Gulf Coast, there's also a recognition that we are rethinking how people get around, how people live. And one of the things that I'm really excited about, given some of the work that we were doing prior to coming into the administration, that even the bipartisan infrastructure law now allows the Department of Transportation to use our existing loan programs, either TIFIA or RIF, to provide low interest loans to local governments and through public-private partnerships with the private sector to build housing and commercial development near your passenger rail stations or your transit stations. And for us as the Department of Transportation, we have now even gone a step further to say for projects that are transit related or TOD related through our TIFIA program, we're willing to go above our current policy of 33% of loan capacity, that we're willing to go up to 49% loan capacity. So this is just an example of some of the many programs that the bipartisan infrastructure law provides you, local government, the private sector, as well as community groups to take advantage. Now, there are a couple things I want to emphasize that you should be aware of if you are trying to be competitive in the many discretionary grant programs, but also if you're representing the state or a transit agency, how you should be thinking about the reporting that we're going to be coming and asking you in terms of how you are aligning your dollars with these policy priorities. One of the first things I want to talk about is the fact that as a Department of Transportation, along with our sister agencies, we have been running fast to meet the president's commitment around Justice 40. By a show of hands, how many of you are aware or heard of the concept Justice 40? Okay. For those who are not aware, on day one, the president signed two major executive orders, first around racial equity, but a second around climate change and climate crisis. And within that established what is called the Justice 40 Initiative, which recognized that right now, with all the new investments that we believe we were going to get at the time, now is an imperative for us to make sure that underserved communities, overburdened communities are actually getting their equitable distribution of resources. And from our perspective, our definition of that is 40% of those investments. So over the last 2 years, the federal agencies across the government have been doing an analysis of what is disadvantaged communities in our space. And for the first time, the Department of Transportation developed a definition of transportation insecurity. And many of you know what that means, the ability that you are spending more than half of your household income on housing and transportation. The fact that you have lack of access, lack of ability to get to job centers and healthcare, and as well as through some of those safety and environmental justice. So through that, the Department of Transportation identified a series of census tracts across the country that we are now prioritizing and calling our Justice 40 communities. These are the communities that we will be tracking to ensure that we are driving those 40% of benefit into over the life of the bipartisan infrastructure law as well as the department. In addition to that, we now have identified within the Department of Transportation 39 programs that we are now calling Justice 40 cover programs, totaling about $204 billion that we will be driving into those census tracts. Now, in addition to those cover programs, in addition to the $204 billion that we're trying to drive to these census tracts, we have now developed a benefit methodology for those indicators. So if you look at one of your communities here, you'll see there's a health indicator, there's a health disadvantage, there's an access disadvantage, or lack of walkability, or lack of transit access. We are now going to be tracking how our investments are actually removing the harm in those census tracts. And we will be requiring our grant recipients of our dollars to report out on an ongoing basis on how the projects that they're designing with their community are actually meeting that as part of that. Now, when you look in terms of Louisiana, what you see in front of you in orange are your Justice 40 census tracts. So if you're a local government, if you're a transit agency in your state DOT, and you're saying, okay, there's all this discretionary grant funding, these are the communities that the Department of Transportation are saying we are prioritizing. In addition to that, when you go and look into those and say, here's the orange, what is actually happening there? Is it a transit issue? Is it a land use issue? Is it an emissions issue? We want to see projects, partnerships, and accountability that addresses those in your applications, and it will be then reported out on an ongoing basis. Now, of course, we have a lot of programs. We have a very bold policy initiative and framework. Here is some of the programs that are currently open today. And a couple I'll call out. So right now, we have a new coverts program. That application closes on February 6th. We have our RAISE grant, that NOFA just went out. We also have new dollars for our public-private partnerships, if you're interested. Our new multimodal program that combine infra, rural, as well as our mega program will be coming out early next year, as well as our Safe Street for All. Now, I'm saying that because I know many of you are going to be rushing to grants.gov, calling your mayor, calling your grant writer to say, hey, make sure we're in the next batch of funding. But here's one of the things our secretary has been very keen on. This is not a story about having good policies. This is not a story to saying we're going to launch new policy initiatives. It's not a story that we have a lot of new money. The question is, what happens when you put good intentions, right partnerships, right policy with the dollars? And with that, I would like to talk about a couple things here. The proof is in the pudding. And as I mentioned before, we just came through our FY22 raise round. And I am pleased to say that Louisiana in FY22 was a huge winner in our round. In this round alone, Louisiana got 5 raise grants. FY21, you got 1. I won't say what you got in previous rounds, but let's just say you're going in the right direction. But the reason why I'm calling that out, because it's the type of projects that we're seeing right now from local governments, from NPOs, from key stakeholders that are coming to queue that really is aligned with the smart growth theme that smart growth principle we've been talking for the past 8.5 years. A couple that I'll call out. First, we gave over $20 million to build 2 new intermodal transit stations, not only in Gonzaga, and as well as right here in Baton Rouge. We all know how those 2 projects is going to expand access and also help remove some of those greenhouse gas emissions that are impacting those surrounding communities. In addition to that, we have the Valentine Batoon Bridge replacement. Rural community, a bridge that has been at the end of its useful life. We know that improving and replacing that bridge is going to reduce travel time for those rural communities who are trying to get to their jobs and the like. These are just a snapshot of the projects, 166 projects that we're seeing across the country. But again, it's projects that are engaging with their community, that are trying to address the issues in their community, that are getting prioritized in our funding line. Now, some people wanted to talk about reconnecting communities. I'm going to spend just a couple of moments to talk about 2 programs I think in the bipartisan infrastructure law you guys really want to learn more about. First is our Reconnecting Communities program. It's $1 billion over the next 5 years, of which we can provide both planning grants and capital grants. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the Reconnecting Communities program? All right. Oh, wait. Not many hands went up. Well, let me take a step back. The Reconnected Communities program is for the first time a recognition that past infrastructure, capital infrastructure programs, whether it's highway or rail or other transportation infrastructure, that have actually created harm in communities. And I think all of you know there are examples either here in Baton Rouge, in New Orleans, but also across the country where we can see that happening in real time, those impacts. This program is designed to undo those harms and give capital and planning grants to communities, to nonprofits who are interested in redesigning, repurposing, or even removing their highways or their rail infrastructure to really create thriving communities. This is by far historic as a department and a moment in time for the country. But in addition to the Reconnected Communities grant program that just closed, and we have over 450 applications, which we only have $190 million to give out this year. We had of the 450 applicants, we had about $1.6 billion in requests for funds. And this is a reminder that there is so much pent up interest in how we can redesign our built environment to make it healthier, more resilient, and more equitable. But what I'm really excited about is the fact that the Department of Transportation, when we look at this program, is something that both myself and the Secretary says a lot. Reconnecting Communities is not a program at the Department of Transportation. It is a principle. Every dollar we spend, whether it's a discretionary grant program or it's our formula dollars done through our state DOTs, NPOs, or transit agencies, we should be using Reconnecting Communities as the principle and guideline. How do we make sure that individuals, regardless of their zip code, can live in truly accessible, safe, thriving, and equitable communities? Our second program that we'll call out is our Safe Streets for Roads for All. Why? Because this was intentionally designed to be supportive of local governments. State DOTs cannot apply for these funds. Only local governments can apply with their NPOs, can apply for these funds. And this is by far one of the most targeted dollars where we are looking for applicants who can clearly show that they have been engaging with their community. They have data-driven analysis to say this intersection or these interventions will help reduce our roadway fatalities. And if you don't have that plan, we are willing to give you those planning grant dollars to do that research, to do that community engagement, to then eventually come back and apply for our, again, we have $1 billion for the next 5 years to help support those efforts. Now, I know a lot of attention has been on around the bipartisan infrastructure law. And before I take my seat, it's also important for me to identify a couple of additional pots of not only funding, but opportunities to help you here in Louisiana to meet some of your smart growth goals. So in addition to the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have a new Inflation Reduction Act that was recently passed. Within the Department of Transportation, we are receiving about $9 to $12 billion, of which I'm going to call out a couple. The first is a $3 billion program called the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program. Now, you may say, what is this program for? It's actually what I like to call Reconnecting Communities Plus Plus. In addition to providing direct grant dollars and planning grants to communities who want to either remove their highway and create boulevards or create more thriving communities and the like, it also allows us to actually think about how we can expand access and address some of your transit desert as well. In addition to those dollars, we have now what things we've heard, particularly from underserved resource communities, is that they need help, people need help getting through the federal permitting process. And so now, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Department of Transportation has about $100 million where we can actually provide technical assistance, contractors to help communities get through that federal process. Now, of course, I know I'm in Louisiana and I'm from South Georgia. I come from ag country. And one of the things I get really excited about is talking about manure. You're like, why? Well, it turns out right now, as you know, transportation is by far the largest emitter of emissions. But it's not just the tailpipe. Is the full cycle. Think about your pavement. And I say manure, I've had a lot of time and a lot of briefings learning about how cow manure can be converted into concrete. By far a sustainable path. Now think about the agriculture businesses that we have here who now think about how they can restructure and take some of their usage and make more sustainable and emission-free components in our transportation system. We have $2 billion to support that. Now, of course, we recognize as a department that we may have now close to $660 billion through the bipartisan infrastructure law, about $10 billion through the Inflation Reduction Act. just sending money out to the street is not enough. We have, as a Department of Transportation last year, started what is called the Thriving Communities Initiative, which is our way of starting a new federal, community, local government partnership, where we want to work directly through a place-based approach to help communities from their visioning all the way to project delivery. And I'm really excited that we got Maria Zimmerman on board last year, and just yesterday, we just closed out our Thriving Communities RFP and NOFA, where we actually had over 372 communities apply to become a Thriving Community. So I hope many of you apply for that. If not, there's a new round coming out next year. But more importantly, we are now going to be coming on the ground with our regional offices, but also, more importantly, we're going to be bringing in our sister agencies to work with you hand in glove to make sure not only the applications are good, but actually the project delivery, it actually happens. And with that being said, how can you help us? How can you be a part of this conversation and this journey? As I mentioned before, 69% of our dollars are coming through formula. Are you engaging with state DOTs as they're reconsidering their STIPs? Are you showing up at the MPO meeting and advocating for projects to get on their tips? Are you doing those equity or climate analysis to ensure that the investments that are coming to your community are making those right impacts? Are you actually thinking about the businesses, minority and women-owned businesses that could be both part of the construction of that infrastructure, but also the surrounding community businesses that will benefit from that new access to that port or the having greater retail and mixed-use opportunities around a transit station? These are things you could be doing right now, today, to when we look back, not 5 years, not 10 years, but literally a generation from now, will we say, here in Louisiana, we have been able to transform underserved and overburdened communities into thriving communities. Now, with that being said, here is a snapshot. I'm sure you're all going to take this picture. If you're looking for technical assistance, if you're looking for someone to call, here's just a snapshot of some of the new resources the Department of Transportation is rolling out to help support you on some of the projects that you're doing. And two, I'll call out. We have our new DOT Navigator. If you've never been in a transportation space in your life, this is the bot for you. You can go, you can ask, look, I'm interested in improving safety. It will tell you exactly the programs that are available for you. We're looking to update that, where now it will actually tell you not only the programs, but also how to fill out the application. So again, my friends, it's a wonderful opportunity to be back with you after so long of being friends with CPEX, but also the summit. Again, I'm looking forward to the conversation, and good luck and Godspeed.
Gosh, well, thanks, Christopher. That was a lot, and given all the money that's coming through your organization, I'm even more grateful for you taking the time to come to us and talk about all this today, because I imagine you don't sleep. So we are going to get into the Q&A with the audience. Words are hard for the moment. So be thinking about questions that you might have for Christopher, because that was a whole lot of information that he just threw out there. But I'm kind of curious, we have a lot of disparities across Louisiana. I mean, you've been here, you understand that. We have a lot of low capacity communities that really can't access these funds very easily. I know the state LMA and Police Jury Association have kind of put together some resources for local communities, but I'm curious about how those rural communities could best access some of this information to position themselves for some of these funds, particularly given the fact that we don't have, we have MPOs, but we don't have RPOs. And so do you have any insight for those rural communities?
Absolutely. Let me first just say something that's very basic. How many of you have actually went and visited one of our division administrator office from FHWA? Show of hands. I see one up here. How many of you actually went and had a pick up a phone call from one of our FTA regional offices? Okay, I see a couple of hands. Why am I saying that? Just off of just a baseline. This is the Department of Transportation. This is our front door. This is our career staff who are literally here to help you, answer your questions, give you understanding of like the processes, even to talk about the availability. Under the great leadership of our acting administrator, Stephanie Pollock, we've really pushed our division offices, which we have from a federal highway perspective, one in every state, to literally be a technical assistance hub. So my first question would be, if you need someone to talk to, call our division offices, whether it's at Federal Highway or our regional offices at FTA. They are there to help. So that's number one. Number two, in addition to that, we do now have some new resources that we're bringing to the table. So first of which is called our Roots Committee, Council. And our Roots Council is a better way of saying it's our front door for rural communities at headquarters. We have a dedicated staff of about 6 individuals who literally are basically the call line for rural communities to say, okay, I don't understand what this rural surface transportation, how do I do a federal requirement? How do I even apply for an application? And their job is to actually walk you through that process. But one of the things I'm really excited about is that Department of Transportation is not doing it alone. So we have partnered with the Department of Agriculture as part of a interagency work called the Rural Prosperity Initiative, where USDA is actually putting in liaisons, on-the-ground navigators in rural communities across the country who will literally pick up the phone and call every agency that you might be interested in. So it's not just a USAID, you're like, hey, I have a stormwater issue. They'll help you connect to the right person at EPA. So there are a number of resources that rural communities can take advantage of. But the last piece I'll also say is the Thriving Communities is great, but actually we've been doing a lot of work as of late to reduce the overall entry level. For example, I came in an FY21 raise, and it was about 100 pages. We're now down to about 50 plus pages. Some of our rural program applications, right? And we started doing things like combining NOFOs so rural communities can apply not just one program, but to multiple programs, because I know, because I've been on the other side, how much it costs to pay a consultant to do an application. So we think through those steps that it makes, hopefully we're reducing the barrier, but at a more basic level, pick up the phone, call our division offices, and they will help you get through the process and better think about that project moving forward.
Okay, that's really great. I'm going to look to the audience. Are there any questions immediately from the audience? It's really hard to see. Oh, there's a gentleman right here in the striped shirt. Oh, hang on one second. They're going to grab the mic for you.
Mike, is it on? Is it on? My name's Jeff Rue. I'm from St. Charles Parish. But the reference to manure story, a friend of mine, his name is David Falls Jr., and he's working with the sugar mill in Raceland to gather the bagasse, the manure, and wood. And with I'm not sure if it's a state agency or a federal agency. And he's been doing that for 4 years down there, and he's very successful at taking wood off my property. And I don't get any manure back. My horse has died.
That's great. Are there any other questions in the audience?
There's one right there and one back there.
One in the back. Is this working? Okay. Over here in the corner, if you can't see me. But Jordy Schulhammer, I'm with Deloitte & Touche. I have a question for you, Chris. I appreciate what you presented about all these programs. With a limited time frame to actually get these projects done, something that we saw happen at the local level with the American Rescue Plan is that there weren't enough workers, obviously with some of the capacity building, to actually show up, bid on these projects, get competitive prices with some of the supply chain issues that they were having. So vendors that were bidding on opportunities were starting to basically default on bid bonds, and they were not able to hire vendors, escalating the prices up and up and up until they weren't sustainable projects anymore. The question I have is, given that every community in the entire U.S. is going to be competing for these grants at the same time to do similar work, what is the plan to phase this so that the costs don't continue to escalate and drive inflation?
Great question. So for those who didn't hear, it's like you're seeing across the construction bidding space just a constant uptick in costs. And oftentimes it's a lack of bids. But also there's an inflation element to this as well, and the supply chain of getting goods and services available. So there are a couple of things that the administration is taking. So first, on a macro standpoint, I think you guys have seen our department has been very aggressive of addressing the overall supply chain crisis. And I think in the last several months, we've seen, even through the spike during the summer, but also I think as we go into the holiday season, that we have been actually being able to get not only the goods that are coming from overseas through our ports clearly, but also most recently, we were able to avert a rail crisis that would have had a significant impact on just making sure we had goods and resources to actually do some of these construction projects. With that, the second thing we're recognizing is that, yes, we actually have a workforce challenge. And that's one of the things that we're hearing a lot. And that's one of the things we are really excited about, because this is something we can actually do something about. And so just recently, we signed a MOU, a memo of understanding with the Department of Labor, where we are providing direct technical assistance to state DOTs and to contractors to actually build out their workforce programs to train workers to get into the space. But interesting enough, here's the other piece. Now, granted, this is a national policy. We recognize that now, how can we use these bipartisan infrastructure law dollars to catalyze pre-apprenticeships and workforce training programs so in your grants? And so right now, we're seeing a lot of grant applicants include that in their application. And we believe building that capacity is going to be huge. Now, granted, that's not a silver bullet, but as you know, these infrastructure projects don't get built in a day or a year. Many of these projects take 5 to 10 years. And one of the things we said early in the process, this is not a stimulus package. We're looking not for just shovel ready, we're looking for shovel worthy. And these projects are going to take time. And so through these macro and specific interventions, we believe we can get the cost of infrastructure projects down, but also bring the workforce needed. But then I think there's something else you brought up that I think is something that we are really focused on as well at the Department of Transportation, is that we need to build more construction businesses, particularly in communities that have not been a part of this conversation. And so we are right now looking at ways that we can span technical assistance, capacity bonding to minority business enterprises and disadvantaged enterprises. And that's something that my colleague, Dr. Shelby Scales, have been leading. I know she did a couple sessions in New Orleans over the last year. So definitely, if you guys are interested in that, we'll love to connect you guys with those resources as well.
That's really great. Mia?
Hey, good afternoon. One of my roles is coordinator for coordinated human services, so assisting operators who are trying to transport people who need to get from point A to point B. A lot of this information, I'm not quite sure how to apply, if at all, to what I do. But do you have any thoughts for, because I don't know if they have the capacity. A lot of people are still returning, honestly, trying to return to 100% operation, even this far out from COVID. Drivers are, it's hard to hire drivers and maintain them and pay them, all of that stuff. So, though I'm not in the position to leverage or build out these applications, what sorts of discussions do you think planners who are tangential to transportation and these sorts of grants should be having when they do have people who are in the transportation sphere, have needs, but may not be able to apply to this? What sorts of conversations ought we be having so that the momentum can go further and, to help the rural communities?
So if I heard you correctly, you're a planner, is that correct?
I am.
Okay. How many planners are in the room? Okay. You might have heard my title. I used to be the Vice President of Land Use and Development, also the former Senior Director at the Transportation for America, working with Beth a while ago. One of the reasons why I think I'm in the role I'm in right now is that there's no transportation over here and land use and planning over here. No, it's all together. And so from a planning perspective, the first question I ask you is, right now the challenges your community has, whether it's an access issue. Oh my gosh, we don't have affordable housing. Oh my gosh, we don't have access to healthcare. Oh my gosh, right? Now, we also know that through land use, economic, and transportation coordination, we can address those things. So first and foremost, my question back to you is, are you taking that analysis and understanding what is in the built environment right now that is underpinning by the land use choices you're making? And then from there, how then should we use economic development resources and transportation dollars to address those issues off the bat? So that's the first thing. Second is your capacity question. You have a capacity need. You right now should be applying for capacity dollars. So the Department of Transportation, as well as the EPA, as well as the Department of Commerce, have capacity dollars that don't just go to transportation, but actually could go to the planning offices. So you can think about, what is our climate and equity and housing strategy? How do we bring that? Oh my gosh, we don't have talent. Let's start hiring either a contractor or bringing that staff. Those dollars are available. So before we even get to the transportation space, one of the things we recognize, both through the American Rescue Plan, but also as part of the Inflation Reduction Act and our bill funding, is that we had to make sure there's enough capacity building dollars to support you. So that's the first thing. The second piece here then is, from that point, there are other issues you could potentially address with your transit. So, hey, we need to bring more transit here. Well, do we have the right-of-way available? What's the planning? Are we engaged with our MPOs to make sure that the system and the plans are aligned so that when our local transit agency does apply to, let's say, our capital improvement grant program or to a RAISE program to do a streetcar and the like, that they are, when they get their application reviewed, we're looking at and say, did you talk to your planning offices? Are you coordinating this together? And I think that's just an example of the type of activities you guys should be doing right now, because we see that on the back end. When applications come through, we see that on the back end. And when you do get awarded, we know if you're not coordinating because your project is stuck. Why hasn't your NEPA gotten done? Why, all those things. So I think that's the issue that I would push back to you to say, you have a moment right now to build that capacity so you can be not only more competitive in getting funds, but also ensuring that the project can actually be delivered.
Okay, what? Yep. This will be the last question.
Okay, I'm Jamila. I work for the LSU Ag Center, so I was excited to hear about the partnerships that you're developing with agriculture. We have a federal grant from CDC, and they task us to work in rural or places that have a percent and working with them to improve those environments. And so we talked a lot about the intersection of public health and planning. So my question to you is there an effort to start working with more public health agencies on the federal level, such as CDC, specifically the NPAO, to do more of this work?
Great question. The question here is we all know the intersectionality of transportation when it comes to not only equity, economic performance, but also public health. And I could say even before joining the administration, working with my colleague Emiko and Emily, we work with the CDC on an everyday routes to everyday destinations. We worked in Sparta, Georgia, specifically, where we were looking at how can we make sure that people can actually get around their community without a car. Because turns out, this was right before pandemic, once the pandemic happened, those same communities that did not have access, did not have good walking and biking, or even just good land use planning and transportation assets, were unfortunately some of the highest rates of COVID in the country. And so from that standpoint, yes, we are actually in active discussions with CDC. We are really excited to see that CDC is planning to invest invest dollars in targeted rural communities to actually hire transportation planners in public health departments so they can understand that transportation. We're going to be leveraging that as well. One of the things I also emphasize is that through our Safe Streets for All program, we saw a number of public health departments partner with their local government in their application. And so one of the things we strongly encourage is those level of inner office, and particularly at the local level, partnerships, because we can see that as a huge opportunity for these grant opportunities.
Well, that's great. Christopher, thank you so much for your time today. That was such great information, and thank you again.
Thank you all. Take care.